The coffee cup slipped from Nurse Sarah Mitchell's trembling fingers, shattering against the emergency room floor as she stared at the patient file. After 30 years at Henry Ford Hospital, she had seen everything: gunshot wounds, overdoses, heart attacks that claimed fathers at Christmas dinner. This was different. The numbers on the chart didn't match the woman lying in bed 7. Betty May Sullivan, 62 years old, factory worker, had walked into their ER thinking she had chemical burns on her neck. The biopsy results told a horror story that made Sarah's stomach turn. Doctor. Chen rushed past, medical chart clutched against her chest, her usual composed demeanor cracking. "Get oncology down here now," she whispered to the attending physician, her voice barely steady. The overnight security guard, a 20-year veteran, stepped back from the doorway, his face pale. Through the thin curtain, Betty May's granddaughter held her grandmother's weathered hand, both of them still believing this was just a workplace accident. Neither knew that what started as 3 small bumps would expose a conspiracy that had been killing workers for decades. How many others were walking around Detroit right now, dismissing similar symptoms as nothing serious? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Betty May Sullivan had always believed that hard work and a good heart would carry her through anything life threw her way. At 62, she still clocked in every afternoon at the Great Lakes Chemical Plant in Detroit, the same factory where she'd spent the last 23 years mixing industrial solvents and cleaning compounds. The pay wasn't much, 14.50 cents an hour, but it was steady work, and steady work meant she could help her granddaughter Emma with college expenses. Her small apartment in Hamtramck reflected a life lived simply but with dignity. Photographs of her late husband Harold covered every surface, frozen moments from their 40-year marriage before his heart attack 8 years ago. Harold's favorite flannel shirt still hung in the closet, smelling faintly of his aftershave and the Marlboro Reds he'd finally quit too late. Betty would sometimes hold that shirt on particularly lonely nights, remembering his voice saying, "Betty May, you're tougher than a $2 steak." The apartment's kitchen table served as her command center where she balanced checkbooks, wrote letters to Emma, and counted out pills for her arthritis and high blood pressure. Her monthly Social Security check of $1,847 had to stretch to cover rent, utilities, groceries, and medications, with whatever remained going toward Emma's graduation gift. A plane ticket to watch her granddaughter walk across that stage in cap and gown. Betty's daily routine never varied. Coffee at 5 in the morning, crossword puzzle from yesterday's paper, then a phone call to Emma before catching the city bus to the factory. The ride through Detroit's industrial corridor gave her time to think about Emma's future, how proud Harold would be to see their granddaughter becoming the first college graduate in the family. Emma was studying environmental science at the University of Michigan, planning to work for the EPA someday. At the factory, Betty worked alongside the same group of women she'd known for decades. Martha Kowalski, 58 and grandmother to 6, operated the mixing station next to hers. Dolores Martinez had been there even longer than Betty, and newcomer Jessica Thompson, barely 23, reminded them all of their younger selves, full of hope and unaware of how hard life could hit. The work was repetitive but demanding. They mixed chemical compounds for everything from industrial cleaners to automotive fluids, wearing whatever protective equipment the company provided. The masks were often old, the gloves frequently torn, and the ventilation system hadn't been updated since the Clinton administration. But jobs were scarce in Detroit, and complaining meant risking unemployment. Frank Morrison, their shift supervisor, constantly reminded them about production quotas and the importance of keeping corporate headquarters happy. Safety meetings were brief and infrequent, usually focused more on avoiding liability than protecting workers. Betty had learned not to ask too many questions about the chemicals they handled, or why some of the newer compounds made her eyes water even through her mask. She lived for Emma's phone calls, hearing about classes and professors and the bright future stretching ahead. Betty never mentioned her aching joints or the persistent cough that had developed over the past year. Emma had enough to worry about with finals and graduation preparations. March 15th started like any other Tuesday for Betty Mae Sullivan. The alarm clock beside Harold's empty pillow buzzed at 5:30 a.m., pulling her from dreams where her husband was still alive and her neck didn't ache from sleeping in awkward positions to avoid the factory's chemical fumes. She shuffled to the bathroom, turning on the harsh fluorescent light that made her look older than her 62 years. That's when she saw them. 3 small red bumps on the left side of her neck, each about the size of a pencil eraser, clustered together like tiny volcanoes against her pale skin. Betty leaned closer to the mirror, squinting without her reading glasses. The bumps weren't painful, just slightly raised and darker red than the rest of her neck. "Well, I'll be," she muttered, touching one gently with her fingertip. It felt warm but not tender. Probably just chemical splash from that busted hose yesterday. The memory came back clearly now. During the previous night's shift, the main mixing line had a malfunction and chemical solvent had sprayed in several directions before Frank Morrison could shut down the system. Betty remembered feeling a few droplets hit her neck area right where her protective collar had shifted during the emergency. She'd wiped it off with a paper towel and thought nothing more about it. Betty opened her makeup compact and dabbed foundation over the bumps. They disappeared easily under the cover-up, and she felt satisfied with her quick diagnosis. 23 years at Great Lakes Chemical had taught her to expect minor skin irritations from workplace exposure. Harold used to say she had skin tougher than leather, and these little bumps would probably disappear within a few days. At the factory that afternoon, Betty mentioned the incident casually to Martha Kowalski while they prepared their workstations. The mixing floor hummed with the familiar sounds of industrial machinery, pumps circulating chemicals through miles of pipes overhead. "Honey, maybe you should get that looked at," Martha said, adjusting her own protective gear. Her voice carried the concern of someone who'd seen too many coworkers dismiss early warning signs. "Remember what happened to Janet Rodriguez 2 years back?" Betty waved off the suggestion. 23 years here, Martha. I've had worse. Remember when that sulfuric acid splash ate right through my work shirt? This is nothing compared to that." Martha wasn't convinced. Janet thought the same thing, started with little bumps, just like yours. "And Janet's fine now," Betty replied, though she couldn't quite remember the details of Janet's situation. Had Janet transferred to another plant, or had she simply quit? The memory seemed fuzzy, which bothered Betty more than she wanted to admit. Frank Morrison appeared at their station, clipboard in hand and the perpetually stressed expression of a man caught between worker safety and corporate profit margins. "Ladies, we're behind quota from yesterday's shutdown. Need you both running at full capacity tonight." "What about the safety inspection after that spill?" Martha asked. "Shouldn't maintenance check the line before we start up again?" Frank's jaw tightened. Maintenance looked at it. "Everything's fine. Just keep production moving." Betty noticed how quickly Frank moved away from their station, avoiding eye contact. In all her years at the plant, she'd learned to read the signs when management was cutting corners. The protective equipment hadn't been updated in 5 years, the ventilation system frequently malfunctioned, and safety meetings had become increasingly rare. But jobs in Detroit were precious, and asking too many questions could lead to restructuring conversations. During her dinner break, Betty sat alone in the employee break room, eating a peanut butter sandwich and calculating her monthly expenses on the back of a napkin. Rent consumed the largest portion of her Social Security check, followed by utilities, groceries, and medications for her arthritis and blood pressure. The remaining $73 was supposed to last until next month, but Emma's graduation was approaching and Betty still needed $200 for the plane ticket to Ann Arbor. She touched the bumps on her neck through her work shirt. A doctor's visit would cost at least $150 at the urgent care clinic, plus whatever tests or medications they might prescribe. The Detroit Community Health Center offered sliding scale payments, but their waiting list stretched for months. Betty had called them once before about her persistent cough and was told the first available appointment was in July. That evening, Betty stopped at the Walgreens near her apartment building. The fluorescent lights made her feel exposed as she searched the pharmacy aisles for something that might help. A tube of antibiotic cream cost $14.99, which seemed expensive but reasonable if it could clear up the bumps quickly. At home, she applied the cream carefully and covered the area with a small bandage. "If it's not better in 2 weeks," she promised herself while looking at Harold's photograph on her nightstand, "I'll think about the clinic." 2 weeks felt like a reasonable timeline. Emma's graduation was still 2 months away, which gave Betty time to see if the bumps would heal on their own. She'd faced worse challenges than a few chemical burns, and Harold's voice echoed in her memory. "Betty May, you're tougher than a $2 steak." April 2nd arrived with an unseasonably cold wind that rattled Betty May's apartment windows and seemed to penetrate straight to her bones. She stood before her bathroom mirror, peeling away the bandage she'd applied the night before, and felt her heart skip a beat. The original 3 bumps had multiplied into 12 distinct lesions, spreading down the left side of her neck like angry red berries on a vine. The antibiotic cream hadn't worked. If anything, the bumps looked angrier, more inflamed than before. Several had developed small white centers that reminded Betty uncomfortably of the boils her grandmother used to get on her arms during the hot Indiana summers of her childhood. She touched one gently and felt a slight discharge on her fingertip. "This isn't right," she whispered to Harold's photograph on the bathroom counter. Her husband's eternally smiling face offered no answers, only the familiar pang of loneliness that had become her constant companion over the past 8 years. Betty applied more foundation than usual, layering it carefully over each bump until they were barely visible. She selected a high-collared blouse from her closet and wrapped one of Harold's old work scarves around her neck, telling herself it was protection against the cold weather. The scarf smelled faintly of motor oil and Old Spice, scents that still brought her comfort. At the Detroit Community Health Center, the receptionist barely looked up from her computer screen when Betty explained her situation. The waiting room was packed with people who looked as desperate as Betty felt. Mothers with crying children, elderly men with persistent coughs, teenagers with injuries they couldn't afford to treat at proper hospitals. "First available appointment is July 18th, ma'am," the receptionist said in a tone that suggested she delivered this news dozens of times daily. "July 18th?" Betty's voice cracked slightly. "That's 3.5 months away." "Emergency cases can be seen same day for a $150 fee," the woman offered, finally making eye contact. "But you'd need to be here when we open at 7 a.m., and we only take the first 10 emergency walk-ins." Betty calculated quickly in her head. $150 represented nearly 2 weeks of grocery money, or half of Emma's graduation plane ticket. The bumps were uncomfortable and unsightly, but they weren't life-threatening. She could wait. "I'll take the July appointment," Betty said, accepting a small card with the date and time written in pencil. Back at work that evening, the mixing floor seemed more chaotic than usual. Jessica Thompson, the youngest member of their crew, was training on a new chemical compound that required extra ventilation. Betty noticed how the girl kept adjusting her protective mask, complaining that it didn't fit properly. "These masks are older than I am," Jessica said during their break. "My cousin had something similar to what you've got, Betty May. Started on her neck, just like yours." Betty's hand instinctively went to her throat. "What happened to her?" "She went to one of those urgent care places. Turned out to be some kind of allergic reaction to the cleaning products at her job. Cleared right up once she switched to hypoallergenic stuff." Hope flickered in Betty's chest. An allergic reaction made perfect sense. She'd been using the same soap and laundry detergent for years, but maybe her skin had become more sensitive with age. That evening, she spent $37 on hypoallergenic soap, shampoo, and laundry detergent at the grocery store. The expense stung, but if Jessica's cousin was right, it would be worth every penny. For 3 days, Betty felt cautiously optimistic. The inflammation around the bumps seemed to decrease slightly, and she convinced herself that the redness was fading. She told Martha about her discovery, proudly explaining how sometimes the simplest solutions were the best ones. "See? Just needed the right soap," Betty said, unwinding her scarf to show Martha the improvement. "Harold always said I was too stubborn to ask for help when I needed it, but sometimes you can figure things out yourself." Martha squinted at Betty's neck under the harsh factory lighting. "Honey, are you sure they look better? Because from where I'm standing—" "They're definitely better," Betty interrupted, quickly rewrapping her scarf. She didn't want to hear doubts when she'd finally found hope. But by April 10th, the improvement had reversed. 2 of the bumps had developed into open sores that leaked a clear fluid, staining the collars of her work shirts despite her careful bandaging. The pain had intensified from a dull ache to sharp stabs that made turning her head difficult. Betty began sleeping propped up on 3 pillows to avoid putting pressure on her neck. Emma called that evening, her voice bright with excitement about upcoming final exams and graduation preparations. "Grandma, you sound tired. Are you feeling okay?" "Just working hard to make sure my girl gets everything she needs," Betty replied, forcing cheerfulness into her voice. She couldn't let Emma worry about her when the girl had so much to focus on. "I can't wait for you to see the campus," Emma continued. "Mom's flying out too, and David said he might drive up from Chicago. It's going to be perfect, Grandma. The whole family together for the first time in years." Betty touched the growing sores on her neck and made a silent promise. Whatever was happening to her body, she would not let it destroy Emma's perfect day. She had 6 weeks to figure this out. 6 weeks to heal whatever was wrong and show up for her granddaughter looking proud and healthy. "I'll be there in my best dress, camera ready," Betty promised, though the words felt heavier than she intended. Through her apartment window, Detroit's skyline glittered in the distance, indifferent to one woman's quiet struggle against time, money, and a body that seemed to be betraying her with each passing day. April 15th marked the beginning of what Betty May would later remember as the longest 3 weeks of her life. The bumps on her neck had evolved into something she could no longer dismiss as a simple chemical burn or allergic reaction. What had started as 12 small lesions had spread into a constellation of angry, weeping sores that wrapped around her throat like a necklace of pain. Each morning brought new horrors discovered in her bathroom mirror. The sores leaked a yellowish fluid that stained her pillowcases and work shirts despite her increasingly elaborate bandaging system. The smell had become noticeable, a sour, metallic odor that reminded her of old pennies left in summer rain. Betty found herself taking longer showers, scrubbing her neck with antibacterial soap until the surrounding skin turned raw, but the smell persisted. Sleep had become nearly impossible. The pain radiated from her neck down into her shoulders and up into her jawline, creating a constant throbbing that over-the-counter pain medication couldn't touch. She'd tried sleeping in Harold's old recliner, propped up at angles that wouldn't put pressure on the affected area, but even then, she rarely managed more than 2 hours at a stretch. The fever started on April 18th, low-grade at first but persistent. Betty would find herself sweating through her work clothes during the factory's night shift, then shivering uncontrollably during her bus ride home. Her supervisor, Frank Morrison, began making pointed comments about her appearance and productivity, though he stopped short of directly confronting her about the increasingly obvious bandages around her neck. "Sullivan, your quality control numbers are slipping," Frank said during one particularly difficult shift. "Corporate's been asking questions about our department's performance." Betty wanted to explain that the constant pain made it difficult to concentrate, that the fever made her hands shake when she tried to operate the mixing equipment, but she knew Frank didn't want to hear excuses. Jobs in Detroit were scarce, and Great Lakes Chemical had a reputation for quickly replacing workers who couldn't maintain their quotas. "I understand, Mr. Morrison," Betty replied, steadying herself against the mixing station. "It won't happen again." Martha Kowalski had been watching Betty's deterioration with growing alarm. During their dinner break on April 20th, she cornered Betty in the employee restroom, where the harsh fluorescent lighting made Betty's condition impossible to hide. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Martha whispered, staring at the bandages that had shifted during Betty's work. "Betty May, you need to see a doctor right now." "I've got an appointment in July," Betty said weakly, attempting to adjust her coverings. "It's probably just taking longer to heal because I'm older." "July? Honey, you could be dead by July?" Martha's voice carried the sharp edge of fear. "I'm going to lend you money for the urgent care clinic. No arguments." Betty's pride flared, despite her exhaustion. "I appreciate it, Martha, but I can handle my own troubles. Harold and I never took charity, and I'm not starting now." "This isn't charity, it's friendship," Martha insisted. "What would Harold say if he knew you were suffering like this because you were too stubborn to accept help?" The question hit Betty harder than she expected. Harold had always been the practical one in their marriage, the voice of reason when her pride threatened to override common sense. But Harold wasn't here to make these decisions anymore, and Betty felt the weight of her solitude more acutely than ever. On April 25th, Betty's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse. She woke at 3 a.m. with severe nausea and had to rush to the bathroom, where she vomited until nothing remained in her stomach but bile. When she looked in the mirror, she saw that several of the sores had burst during the night, leaving raw, bleeding craters in her neck. The pain had intensified to the point where she could barely turn her head without crying out. For the first time since Harold's death, Betty May Sullivan felt truly afraid. She called in sick to work that day, something she hadn't done in over 2 years. Frank Morrison's response was predictably cold. "Hope you feel better soon, Sullivan. We can't afford to carry dead weight much longer." Alone in her apartment, Betty sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by medical bills from her previous doctor visits for arthritis and blood pressure medication. The numbers seemed to swim before her fever-bright eyes. $127 for blood pressure medication, $89 for her last physical exam, $43 for arthritis pills. Adding an urgent care visit would push her monthly expenses beyond her Social Security income, but the alternative was becoming impossible to ignore. That afternoon, she made 2 phone calls that changed everything. The first was to the urgent care clinic near downtown Detroit. The receptionist quoted her a base fee of $89 for the examination, plus additional costs for any tests or treatments the doctor might recommend. Betty made an appointment for the following morning, using nearly all of her remaining grocery money for the month. The second call was to her daughter Sarah in Portland. "Mom, you sound terrible," Sarah said immediately. "Are you sick?" Betty had planned to keep the conversation light, to ask about Sarah's job and the grandchildren Betty rarely saw. Instead, she found herself breaking down completely, sobbing into the phone as she described the sores, the pain, the fear that had been growing inside her for weeks. "Why didn't you call me sooner?" Sarah's voice was tight with panic and frustration. "Mom, I'm booking a flight right now. I'll be there tomorrow." "Don't you dare," Betty said, finding her strength again. "You've got your own family to worry about. Besides, I'm seeing a doctor tomorrow. It's probably just some kind of infection that needs antibiotics." "Promise me you'll call the minute you know anything," Sarah demanded, "and promise me you'll let me help if you need it." Betty promised, though both women knew how difficult it would be for Betty to keep that second promise. The urgent care visit on April 26th was both reassuring and terrifying. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, examined Betty's neck with professional detachment, asking questions about workplace chemical exposure, family medical history, and the timeline of symptoms. This looks like a severe contact dermatitis, possibly complicated by secondary bacterial infection, Dr. Walsh concluded after 15 minutes of examination. I'm prescribing a stronger topical antibiotic and some oral medication to fight the infection. Betty felt a wave of relief wash over her. An infection was treatable, manageable, something that wouldn't destroy her plans for Emma's graduation. How long before it heals? Betty asked. With proper treatment, you should see significant improvement within 2 weeks, Dr. Walsh replied, scribbling prescriptions on her pad. But Mrs. Sullivan, if this doesn't improve or if it gets worse, you need to see a dermatologist immediately. Some workplace chemical exposures can cause serious long-term complications. The prescriptions cost $47 at the pharmacy, money Betty had earmarked for Emma's graduation gift. Standing in the Walgreens checkout line, she made mental calculations about what she could cut from her budget to make up the difference. She'd skip groceries for a few days, maybe ask the church food pantry for help, though the thought made her stomach clench with shame. For 3 days, Betty felt cautiously optimistic. The stronger antibiotics seemed to slow the progression of the sores, and the pain decreased enough for her to return to work. Frank Morrison made no comment about her absence, but Betty noticed him watching her more closely during their shifts. Jessica Thompson approached her on April 29th with news that made Betty's blood run cold. I talked to my cousin again, Jessica said during their break, about her neck bumps. Turns out I was wrong about what happened to her. Betty set down her coffee cup carefully, sensing bad news approaching. She didn't have an allergic reaction, Jessica continued. She had skin cancer, had to have surgery to remove it, then radiation treatments. She's okay now, but the doctor said if she'd waited much longer. Jessica's words trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the air between them. That night, Betty stood before her bathroom mirror and forced herself to really look at her reflection for the first time in days. The antibiotics had slowed the infection, but the underlying problem was clearly getting worse. The sores had a different quality now, deeper and more persistent than any chemical burn should be. The edges were raised and irregular, with a waxy appearance that reminded her uncomfortably of the skin cancer her mother had battled in her 70s. Emma called that evening, bubbling with excitement about her upcoming graduation ceremony. She described her cap and gown, the party her friends were planning, the job interviews she'd scheduled for the summer. Betty listened with growing despair, realizing that her granddaughter's perfect day was just 3 weeks away, and she was running out of time to get better. I can't wait for you to meet Professor Martinez, Emma was saying. She's the one who wrote my recommendation letter for the EPA internship. She says I remind her of herself when she was young and idealistic. That's wonderful, sweetheart, Betty managed, touching the bandages on her neck. Your grandfather would be so proud. After they hung up, Betty sat alone in Harold's recliner, surrounded by the photographs and mementos of their life together. For the first time since his death, she found herself angry with him for leaving her alone to face this crisis. Harold would have known what to do. Harold would have insisted she see specialists, would have found a way to pay for proper medical care. But Harold wasn't here, and Betty Mae Sullivan was facing the fight of her life with nothing but her own stubborn determination and rapidly dwindling resources. May 18th, 11:30 p.m. The factory floor hummed with its usual mechanical rhythm when Betty Mae Sullivan felt the world begin to spin around her. She was standing at mixing station 7, adding the final chemical component to a batch of industrial degreaser, when the pain in her neck suddenly intensified beyond anything she had experienced in the past 2 months. The sores had continued spreading despite the antibiotics, now covering nearly half of her throat and extending down toward her collarbone. That morning, she had discovered that several of the lesions had merged into larger, crater-like wounds that bled continuously through her bandages. The metallic smell had become so pronounced that other workers unconsciously stepped back when she approached their stations. Betty gripped the metal railing of the mixing platform, her knuckles white with effort as she fought against the dizziness that threatened to overwhelm her. The overhead lights seemed blindingly bright, and the chemical vapors that she'd tolerated for 23 years suddenly made her stomach lurch with nausea. "Easy there, Betty May," Martha called from the adjacent station, but her voice sounded distant and distorted as if coming from underwater. Betty tried to respond, tried to wave Martha off with her usual assurance that everything was fine, but when she opened her mouth, only a strangled gasp emerged. Her vision blurred and she felt something warm and wet flowing down her neck. When she touched the bandages, her fingers came away bright red with blood. The collapse happened in slow motion. Betty's legs simply gave out beneath her, and she crumpled to the concrete floor of the factory, her body convulsing as shock set in. The sound of her fall, a sickening combination of flesh hitting concrete and machinery continuing its indifferent operation, brought the entire night shift running. Martha reached her first, kneeling beside Betty's prone form and carefully peeling back the blood-soaked bandages to assess the damage. What she saw made her gasp audibly. The sores had ruptured completely, creating open wounds that revealed tissue that looked wrong, too deep, too irregular, with edges that appeared almost crystalline under the harsh factory lighting. "Jesus Christ," whispered Dolores Martinez, covering her mouth with her hands. "Call 911 right now." "No," Betty whispered weakly, struggling to sit up despite the blood loss. "No ambulance. I can't afford. Emma's graduation is in 2 days." "Betty May, you're bleeding all over the floor," Martha said firmly, pressing clean shop rags against the worst of the wounds. "This isn't about money anymore. This is about staying alive." Frank Morrison appeared at the edge of the gathering crowd, his face pale as he took in the scene. Betty could see him calculating the potential liability, the workers' compensation claims, the safety inspections that would inevitably follow. His first instinct wasn't concern for her well-being, it was damage control. "What happened here?" he demanded, though the evidence was pooling on the factory floor around Betty's crumpled form. "She collapsed," Martha said without looking up from her first aid efforts. "The sores on her neck have been getting worse for months, and she finally can't work through it anymore." "Months?" Frank's voice carried a sharp edge of panic. "Why wasn't I informed about a workplace injury months ago?" Betty tried to speak, to explain that she hadn't wanted to cause trouble, but the effort of talking made more blood flow from her throat. The taste of copper filled her mouth, and she realized with crystal clarity that she was in serious trouble. The ambulance arrived 18 minutes later, though it felt like hours to Betty as she drifted in and out of consciousness on the factory floor. The paramedics, a young man who looked barely older than Emma and a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, worked with practiced efficiency to stabilize her for transport. "Ma'am, can you tell me when these wounds first appeared?" the female paramedic asked while starting an IV line in Betty's arm. "March," Betty whispered. "Started with just 3 little bumps. Thought it was chemical splash from work." The paramedics exchanged a look that Betty didn't like, a professional assessment that carried implications she wasn't ready to face. During the ambulance ride to Henry Ford Hospital, Betty found herself staring at the ceiling of the emergency vehicle, listening to the steady beep of monitoring equipment and the radio chatter between the crew and the hospital. She thought about Emma, who would be expecting her usual goodnight phone call in a few hours. She thought about the graduation ceremony just 48 hours away and the new dress she'd bought on layaway but hadn't yet picked up from the store. Most of all, she thought about Harold and wondered if he was watching her struggle with the same mixture of pride and frustration he'd shown during their 40 years of marriage. Harold had always said she was too stubborn for her own good, too proud to ask for help when she needed it most. The emergency room at Henry Ford Hospital was a controlled chaos of medical professionals responding to Detroit's nightly collection of traumas. Betty was wheeled into Examination Room 7, where she found herself staring up at fluorescent lights while a team of nurses worked to clean and assess her wounds. Dr. Patricia Chen, a sharp-eyed emergency physician in her late 40s, took one look at Betty's neck and immediately called for additional consultations. Her expression was carefully controlled, but Betty caught the flash of concern that crossed her features before the professional mask slipped back into place. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need to ask you some detailed questions about your work environment," Dr. Chen said, pulling up a chair beside the examination table. "These wounds are unlike anything I'd expect to see from typical chemical burns." Betty found herself describing the Great Lakes chemical plant in detail, the types of compounds they mixed, the condition of the protective equipment, the ventilation systems that frequently malfunctioned. As she talked, Dr. Chen took careful notes, occasionally asking for clarification about specific chemicals or exposure incidents. "Have other workers experienced similar symptoms?" Dr. Chen asked. Betty thought about Jessica's cousin, about Janet Rodriguez, who had transferred to another plant under mysterious circumstances, about the persistent cough that seemed to affect half the night shift crew. "Maybe," Betty admitted. "I never really thought about it before." Dr. Chen excused herself to consult with colleagues, leaving Betty alone with her thoughts and the steady drip of IV fluids. Through the thin curtain that separated her from the rest of the emergency room, she could hear other patients: a gunshot victim being rushed into surgery, an elderly man with chest pains, a young woman suffering from a drug overdose. When Dr. Chen returned 20 minutes later, she was accompanied by Dr. Michael Santos from the hospital's oncology department. Betty's heart began racing before either doctor spoke a word. "Mrs. Sullivan," Dr. Chen said gently, "we need to run some additional tests. What you're experiencing isn't consistent with chemical burns or contact dermatitis. We're concerned that these lesions might be something more serious." "More serious how?" Betty asked, though she already knew the answer would change everything. Dr. Santos stepped forward, his expression kind but grave. "We suspect these might be cancerous lesions, Mrs. Sullivan. The appearance, the rapid spread, the way they've responded to treatment, all of these factors suggest malignancy." The word hit Betty like a physical blow. Cancer. The disease that had taken her mother at 78, that had claimed Harold's brother at 55, that represented everything she feared most about growing old alone. "But I need to be at my granddaughter's graduation on Saturday," Betty said weakly, as if her commitment to Emma could somehow override medical reality. "Mrs. Sullivan," Dr. Chen said carefully, "if our suspicions are correct, attending your granddaughter's graduation might not be possible. We need to begin treatment immediately." Betty closed her eyes and tried to picture Emma in her cap and gown, walking across the stage at the University of Michigan, while an empty chair sat in the audience where her grandmother should have been. The image was unbearable, but the alternative, missing Emma's graduation because she was dead, was worse. "What do you need to do?" Betty asked, opening her eyes to meet Dr. Chen's compassionate gaze. "We need to perform a biopsy tonight and get the results rush processed," Dr. Chen explained. "If it's what we think it is, surgery will be required within days, not weeks." Betty nodded slowly, feeling the weight of 23 years of chemical exposure, 8 years of widowhood, and 62 years of stubborn independence finally catching up with her. Emma's perfect graduation day was slipping away, but Betty May Sullivan was finally ready to fight for her life. The biopsy results arrived at 6:47 a.m. on May 19th, delivered by a pathologist whose grim expression told Betty everything she needed to know before he spoke a single word. Dr. Chen held the report in her hands like it contained explosive material, her usual professional composure cracking as she approached Betty's hospital bed. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm afraid the news isn't good," Dr. Chen began, pulling a chair close to Betty's bedside. "The tissue samples show aggressive squamous cell carcinoma that has metastasized to your lymph nodes. This isn't a chemical burn. This is advanced cancer that's been growing for months, possibly years." Betty felt the words wash over her like ice water. Advanced cancer. Metastasized. The medical terminology sounded foreign and terrifying, but their meaning was crystal clear. She was dying, and she had been dying for longer than anyone realized. "How long?" Betty asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the hum of medical equipment surrounding her bed. Dr. Chen consulted her notes carefully. "Without treatment, we're looking at weeks to months. The cancer has spread beyond the primary site and it's growing rapidly. But Mrs. Sullivan, with aggressive treatment, surgery followed by radiation and chemotherapy, there's still hope for full recovery." "What would that cost?" Betty asked, though she already dreaded the answer. "The initial surgery alone would be approximately $85,000, Dr. Chen replied. "The full treatment protocol, including radiation and chemotherapy, could reach $200,000 or more." Betty closed her eyes and did the mental arithmetic that had governed her entire adult life. Her Social Security payments for the next 10 years wouldn't cover even half that amount. Her savings account held $400. Her checking account had $73. The sum total of her financial resources wouldn't pay for a single day in the hospital. "Mrs. Sullivan, we need to contact your family," Dr. Chen continued gently. "And we need to explore charity care options, Medicaid applications, clinical trials. There are resources available." "My granddaughter graduates tomorrow," Betty said, as if this fact could somehow override medical reality. "I promised her I'd be there." At 9:15 a.m., Sarah Sullivan Chen arrived at Henry Ford Hospital after taking the red-eye flight from Portland. Betty's daughter looked exactly like her father had in moments of crisis, jaw set with determination, eyes bright with unshed tears, moving with purpose despite the fear that radiated from every gesture. "Mom, why didn't you tell me how bad this was?" Sarah demanded, though her anger was tempered by relief at finding her mother alive and coherent. "I didn't know," Betty replied honestly. "I thought it was just chemical burns from the factory. I was treating it with drugstore cream and trying to save money for Emma's graduation." Sarah's expression shifted from anger to heartbreak as she truly saw her mother's condition for the first time. The bandages covered most of Betty's neck and upper chest, but the visible portions showed angry, weeping sores that looked nothing like chemical burns. The smell of infection hung heavy in the hospital room despite the medical staff's best efforts. "Emma's flying in this afternoon," Sarah said, taking her mother's hand. "I called her after I got Dr. Chen's message. She's devastated, but she wants to be here." "She should be at her graduation ceremony," Betty protested weakly. "This is the most important day of her life. I won't let my sickness ruin it." "Mom, you're more important than any ceremony," Sarah replied firmly. "Emma knows that. We all know that, Dr." Chen returned at noon with Jane Martinez, a social worker who specialized in medical financial assistance. Jane was a small, energetic woman in her 30s who spoke with the rapid efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering bad news quickly. "Mrs. Sullivan, I've reviewed your financial situation and explored all available options," Jane began, consulting a thick folder of paperwork. "The Charity Care Program has an 8-month waiting list for approval. Medicaid applications typically take 6 to 12 weeks to process. The hospital's emergency assistance fund could cover perhaps 10% of your treatment costs. What about clinical trials? Sarah asked desperately. There are 2 trials currently enrolling patients with your mother's condition, Jane replied. One is in Boston, one is in Houston. Both would require relocating for 6 months of treatment, and neither covers living expenses for patients or families. Betty listened to the conversation with growing despair. Every option seemed designed for people with resources she'd never possessed. Family members who could afford to relocate, savings accounts that could cover months of living expenses, social safety nets that actually functioned for working-class Americans. At 3:30 p.m., Emma arrived at the hospital, still wearing her University of Michigan sweatshirt and carrying the cap and gown she'd picked up that morning for tomorrow's ceremony. Betty's 19-year-old granddaughter took one look at her grandmother's condition and burst into tears. "Grandma, I'm so sorry," Emma sobbed, collapsing into the chair beside Betty's bed. "I should have known something was wrong when you sounded so tired on the phone." "This isn't your fault, sweetheart," Betty whispered, reaching up to stroke Emma's hair with hands that trembled from medication and exhaustion. "You focus on your graduation tomorrow. Make your grandfather proud." "I'm not going to graduation," Emma said firmly. "I'm staying here with you." "You absolutely are going to graduation," Betty replied with more strength than she'd shown all day. "I didn't work 23 years in that factory and sacrifice everything to watch you throw away your achievements because of me." The room fell silent, except for the steady beeping of Betty's monitors and the distant sounds of hospital activity in the corridor. 3 generations of Sullivan women sat together, each grappling with the impossible mathematics of American healthcare, where love and determination meant nothing without money, where a lifetime of hard work could be erased by a single catastrophic illness. Betty looked at her daughter and granddaughter and realized that her death would destroy more than just her own dreams. Sarah would probably mortgage her Portland house to pay for treatment that might not work. Emma would carry guilt about her graduation day for the rest of her life. The financial and emotional catastrophe would ripple through their family for years. "I need some time to think," Betty said quietly. "Both of you go get some dinner. Come back this evening and we'll figure out what comes next." After they left, Betty Mae Sullivan lay alone in her hospital bed, staring at the ceiling tiles and contemplating the cruelest irony of her life. She had finally found something worth fighting for: more time with her granddaughter, the chance to see Emma build the career that Betty's generation of women could never have imagined, but she lacked the resources to wage that fight. May 20th arrived gray and drizzling, as if the Michigan sky itself understood the tragedy unfolding at Henry Ford Hospital. Emma's graduation ceremony was scheduled for 2 p.m. at the University of Michigan's Chrysler Center, but instead of preparing for her moment of triumph, Betty Mae's granddaughter sat in a hospital chair holding her grandmother's increasingly frail hand. Betty had deteriorated overnight. The cancer seemed to be accelerating now that its presence was known, spreading with a vicious efficiency that stunned even the medical team. New lesions had appeared on her chest and shoulders, and her breathing had become labored as the malignancy pressed against vital structures in her throat. At 10 a.m., Martha Kowalski arrived at the hospital carrying a cardboard box that would change everything. Betty's longtime co-worker looked haggard, her usually neat appearance disheveled, as if she'd been up all night wrestling with demons of her own. "Betty Mae, I need to tell you something," Martha said, setting the box on the hospital bed's over table with shaking hands. "I've been cleaning out my basement, and I found these." Inside the box were dozens of documents: safety reports, chemical exposure logs, internal memos, and medical records dating back 15 years. The papers were yellowed with age and bore the official letterhead of Great Lakes Chemical Corporation, but many were stamped with red, confidential markings that suggested they were never meant to see daylight. I used to date Jimmy Rodriguez, Janet's brother, Martha explained, her voice barely above a whisper. After Janet got sick, Jimmy started asking questions, demanding answers from the company. They offered him money to keep quiet, but he kept copies of everything first. Betty's eyes widened as she recognized names on the medical reports. Workers she'd known for years. People who had quietly left the plant or transferred to other facilities, some who had simply stopped showing up for work without explanation. "Look at this one," Martha said, pulling out a document dated 3 years earlier. "Maria Santos, mixing station operator, diagnosed with throat cancer after 18 months of exposure to the new solvent compounds. Company settled for $50,000 and a non-disclosure agreement." "And this one," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. "Robert Chen, night shift supervisor, lung cancer at 43 years old. Company paid his medical bills in exchange for his signature on a liability waiver." Emma leaned forward, her environmental science training helping her understand the implications of what they were reading. "Grandma, these chemicals you've been working with, some of them are known carcinogens. The company has been covering up worker illnesses for over a decade. Doctor." Chen, who had been quietly listening from the doorway, stepped into the room with an expression of barely controlled fury. "Mrs. Sullivan, if these documents are authentic, your cancer isn't just a medical issue, it's a criminal matter. This represents systematic endangerment of workers and deliberate concealment of occupational health hazards." Betty felt a strange sensation washing over her, something she hadn't experienced since Harold's death 8 years ago. It wasn't hope exactly, but it was the opposite of the helpless despair that had consumed her since receiving her diagnosis. It was anger, pure and righteous and energizing. "What can we do with this information?" Sarah asked, having arrived just in time to hear Dr. Chen's assessment. "We contact the EPA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office," Dr. Chen replied. "And we contact Patricia Goldman. She's one of the best environmental law attorneys in Michigan. She's been trying to build a case against Great Lakes Chemical for years." At 11:47 a.m., Emma made a decision that would haunt and inspire her for the rest of her life. While her family huddled around Martha's box of evidence, she pulled out her smartphone and began typing a social media post that would change everything. The photograph she chose showed Betty in her hospital bed, surrounded by IV lines and monitoring equipment, but smiling weakly at the camera. Emma had taken it earlier that morning when her grandmother had insisted on having her hair brushed and lipstick applied in case any handsome doctors stopped by. Emma's caption was simple and devastating. "This is my grandmother, Betty Mae Sullivan. She worked 23 years at Great Lakes Chemical to help pay for my college education. The company gave her cancer, then fired her when she got too sick to work. She's supposed to be at my graduation today, but instead she's fighting for her life because she couldn't afford to see a doctor. Please share her story. #Justice for Betty. Workers, safety, Great Lakes Chemical." Within 30 minutes, the post had been shared 500 times. Within 2 hours, it had reached 10,000 shares and caught the attention of local news outlets. By noon, as Emma should have been putting on her cap and gown, her grandmother's story was trending on social media platforms across Michigan. The first reporter arrived at 12:45 p.m., Jenny Walsh from WXYZ, Detroit, a tenacious investigative journalist who had been following rumors about Great Lakes Chemical for months. She took one look at Betty's condition, reviewed Martha's documentation, and immediately called her news director. "We're leading with this tonight," Jenny told Betty after a brief interview. "And I'm calling every contact I have at the EPA and OSHA. This is exactly the kind of corporate cover-up that destroys working families." At 1:30 p.m., as graduation ceremonies began at the University of Michigan, Betty's hospital room had become an impromptu command center. Martha was on the phone with OSHA investigators. Dr. Chen was consulting with oncology specialists about experimental treatment options, and Sarah was fielding calls from attorneys who had seen Emma's viral social media post. Emma sat beside her grandmother's bed, live streaming the graduation ceremony on her laptop, so Betty could watch her classmates receive their diplomas. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Emma was missing the ceremony she'd worked 4 years to achieve, but Betty was seeing it anyway through the miracle of technology. "Look, Grandma," Emma said, pointing to the screen where the environmental science graduates were being called to the stage. "That should be me walking right now." "That will be you next year," Betty replied firmly, surprising everyone in the room with the strength in her voice. "Because you're going to graduate school to study environmental law, and you're going to make sure no other grandmothers go through what we're going through today." At 2:15 p.m., Patricia Goldman arrived at the hospital. The environmental attorney was a small, fierce woman in her 50s who had built her reputation taking on corporate polluters and winning. She reviewed Martha's documents with the speed and precision of someone who had seen similar cases dozens of times. "Mrs. Sullivan, I want to represent you and every other worker who's been harmed by Great Lakes Chemical," Patricia said after her review. "Based on what I'm seeing here, this could be one of the largest occupational health settlements in Michigan history." "What about the medical bills?" Sarah asked desperately. "My mother needs treatment now, not after years of legal proceedings." Patricia smiled for the first time since entering the room. "That's the beauty of cases like this. Once I file the lawsuit tomorrow morning, the company's insurance carriers will want to settle quickly to avoid the publicity nightmare that's already building. I estimate we'll have a settlement offer within 2 weeks that will cover all medical expenses and provide substantial compensation for your mother's suffering." Betty May Sullivan closed her eyes and felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just for herself, but for Martha and Jessica and all the other workers still breathing toxic air at Great Lakes Chemical, still wondering if those persistent coughs and mysterious rashes were just part of the job. 1 year later, Betty May Sullivan stood at the podium of the University of Michigan Law School's Hutchins Hall, looking out at an audience of 300 students, faculty members, and environmental justice advocates. The woman who had nearly died from occupational cancer was now delivering the keynote address at the school's Environmental Law Symposium, her voice strong and clear as she spoke about worker safety and corporate accountability. The physical transformation was remarkable. The angry sores that had once consumed her neck had healed completely, leaving only faint scars that she wore like badges of honor. Her hair had grown back thicker after chemotherapy, and the weight she'd lost during treatment had been replaced by the healthy glow of someone who had fought death and won. But the deeper changes were even more profound. Betty May Sullivan had discovered a purpose that extended far beyond her own survival. 18 months ago, I thought 3 small bumps on my neck were chemical burns from a workplace accident," Betty began, her words carrying the weight of lived experience. "Today, I stand before you as living proof that ordinary people can hold powerful corporations accountable when they unite around truth and refuse to be silenced." In the front row, Emma beamed with pride. Betty's granddaughter had indeed returned to complete her undergraduate degree, walking across the graduation stage 9 months after her original ceremony in a moment that brought the entire family to tears. Now, in her 2nd year of law school, Emma had already secured a summer internship with the Environmental Protection Agency, following the path her grandmother's struggle had illuminated. The legal victory had been swift and decisive. Patricia Goldman's lawsuit against Great Lakes Chemical Corporation had uncovered a conspiracy of silence that stretched back 2 decades, affecting more than 200 workers. The company's own internal documents, revealed during discovery, showed that executives had known about the carcinogenic properties of their chemical compounds since 2010, but had chosen to conceal the risks to avoid costly safety upgrades. The $47 million class action settlement had transformed the lives of every affected worker. Betty's individual compensation of $2.8 million had not only covered her medical expenses, but had funded the establishment of Harold's Hope Clinic, a free medical facility located just 3 miles from the Great Lakes chemical plant. The clinic specialized in early detection and treatment of occupational illnesses, providing services that had already saved dozens of lives. Dr. Patricia Chen had left her position at Henry Ford Hospital to serve as the clinic's chief medical officer, drawn by the opportunity to practice preventive medicine in underserved communities. Nurse Sarah Mitchell had followed her, bringing 30 years of emergency room experience to bear on occupational health screening. The clinic had become a model for similar facilities across the industrial Midwest, proving that early intervention could prevent the kind of crisis Betty had endured. The real victory wasn't the money, Betty continued, her voice carrying to the back of the packed auditorium. The real victory was discovering that my voice, the voice of one factory worker from Detroit, could be heard in corporate boardrooms, congressional hearings, and courtrooms across America. The ripple effects had extended far beyond Michigan. Betty's story had inspired the passage of the Worker Protection Act in Congress, legislation that strengthened OSHA's ability to investigate workplace safety violations and imposed criminal penalties on executives who concealed health hazards from employees. 12 states had adopted similar laws, and Betty had testified before legislative committees from California to Maine. Great Lakes Chemical Corporation had paid more than legal settlements. The company's stock price had plummeted following the revelations, leading to a complete restructuring of its management team. Federal regulators had imposed $15 million in additional fines, and 3 former executives faced criminal charges for conspiracy and endangerment. The plant where Betty had worked for 23 years had been shuttered permanently. Its operations moved to a new facility built to the highest environmental and safety standards. Martha Kowalski had used her settlement money to return to school, earning a degree in occupational safety that led to a position as a workplace safety inspector for the state of Michigan. Her transformation from factory worker to safety advocate had been as dramatic as Betty's journey from victim to activist. The 2 women remained close friends, bound together by shared trauma and common purpose. "But I want you to remember," Betty said, pausing to look directly at Emma in the front row, "that behind every environmental law, every safety regulation, every corporate accountability measure, there are human beings whose lives hang in the balance. My granddaughter missed her graduation ceremony because I was fighting for my life in a hospital bed. That's the real cost of corporate negligence. Not just the medical bills or lost wages, but the stolen moments, the missed celebrations, the fear that keeps families awake at night." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Many were taking notes, but others simply listened with the focused attention that profound truth demands. Harold's Hope Clinic had screened more than 2,800 workers in its first year of operation, detecting 127 cases of occupational illness in their early stages. The cost savings in human suffering and medical expenses were incalculable, but the clinic's impact went beyond mere statistics. It had restored trust between working families and the healthcare system, proving that quality medical care could be delivered without regard to insurance status or ability to pay. Betty's daily routine now included morning rounds at the clinic, where she served as patient advocate and mentor to newly diagnosed workers. She helped them navigate the complex worlds of workers' compensation, legal remedies, and medical treatment, drawing on hard-won experience to guide others through crises similar to her own. I used to think that my role in life was to work quietly, cause no trouble, and take care of my family, Betty reflected. I never imagined that my greatest contribution would come from standing up and speaking out. But sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing you ever did for others. In the months following her recovery, Betty had become a sought-after speaker at conferences, universities, and community organizations. Her memoir, Tougher Than a $2 Steak, had become a bestseller, with proceeds funding additional occupational health clinics in industrial communities across the Great Lakes region. The personal healing had been as important as the public victories. Sarah had moved back to Michigan, taking a position at the University of Michigan's School of Public Health, where she could be closer to her mother and daughter. The three generations of Sullivan women now lived within 20 minutes of each other, sharing Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations that had been impossible when geography and financial stress kept them apart. Emma's law school classmates had elected her president of the Environmental Law Society, recognizing her unique perspective as someone who had witnessed environmental injustice firsthand. Her undergraduate thesis on occupational health disparities had been published in a peer-reviewed journal, and she had already received job offers from environmental advocacy organizations across the country. In closing, Betty said, her voice growing stronger as she approached the end of her address, I want you to remember that the law is not an abstract concept. It's a tool for protecting the vulnerable and holding the powerful accountable. Every statute you study, every case you read, every brief you write has the potential to save lives like mine. She paused, looking out at the young faces in the audience, seeing in them the future of environmental justice. My husband Harold used to say I was tougher than a $2 steak. Turns out he was right, but what I've learned is that we're all tougher than we know. And when we stand together, when we refuse to be silenced, when we demand justice, we're unstoppable. The standing ovation lasted for 5 full minutes, but Betty Mae Sullivan's real victory was sitting in the front row, wearing a University of Michigan Law School sweatshirt and planning a career dedicated to protecting workers like her grandmother. Betty Mae Sullivan's journey from a desperate factory worker to a champion of justice proves that it's never too late to discover your true purpose. At 62, facing advanced cancer and financial ruin, she could have given up. Instead, her courage to speak out transformed not only her own life, but the lives of thousands of workers across America. Today, Betty watches her granddaughter Emma thrive in law school, knowing that her fight created opportunities her own generation never had. Harold's Hope Clinic stands as a testament to the power of one person's refusal to remain silent in the face of injustice. Betty's story reminds us that our greatest contributions often emerge from our deepest struggles, and that the wisdom earned through hardship can light the way for others. Her transformation from victim to advocate shows that at any age, we possess the strength to change systems, protect our families, and leave legacies that matter. Sometimes the worst chapter of our lives becomes the foundation for the most meaningful one. Have you ever faced a moment when standing up for what's right felt impossible but necessary? What dreams or causes are you still passionate about pursuing, regardless of your age? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to find their courage.